The clock read 8:42 a.m. as Kendrick Robinson parked his black sedan in the cracked lot outside the municipal courthouse in Greenville, South Carolina. The morning sun glared against the windshield, painting sharp shadows across the pavement. Kendrick gripped the steering wheel tighter than he meant to. He hated being late. Discipline was his life. Punctuality was his rule. And yet, here he was, slipping minutes behind. Kendrick Robinson, Assistant United States Attorney, the man who built cases against human traffickers and corrupt officials, sat for one quiet breath in his car and felt like a boy again. A boy who used to run barefoot through his grandmother's backyard. The same grandmother who had left him the house he now fought to protect. That house wasn't just walls. It was his anchor. It was Sunday dinners, gospel humming through the kitchen, the woman who had taught him right from wrong with nothing but her hands and her steady eyes. And now the city had raised its taxes without reason, as if they could rewrite history and rip out his roots with a careless number. He straightened his tie, dark navy, against a crisp white shirt, and pushed open the door. The warm Carolina air wrapped around him, sticky with the smell of asphalt and exhaust. His phone buzzed. He glanced down. A message from his assistant. "Be careful. The judge in Greenville has a reputation. He doesn't like latecomers." Kendrick exhaled slowly. His morning had already been wrecked by an urgent motion in a human trafficking case. He had read it, drafted a response, and sent it to his team before rushing here. It wasn't laziness. It wasn't carelessness. It was duty. The kind of duty that didn't wait for the clock. He shoved the phone into his briefcase and walked toward the courthouse steps, the old brick building looming over him like a relic that refused to crumble. Inside, the air was cool, laced with coffee and paper. The walls were beige, chipped from decades of scuffed shoes and nervous hands. People sat shoulder to shoulder on wooden benches, their faces tight with worry. Parking tickets, minor disputes, tiny battles that still weighed heavy. Kendrick checked his watch. 8:50. 10 minutes to spare. Barely. His shoes tapped steady down the narrow hall, past whispered conversations and shuffling papers. Room 204. Brass letters etched the name. Judge Charles Whitman. Kendrick smoothed his tie, squared his shoulders, and pushed through the door. The courtroom was alive with tension. A young mother bouncing her toddler on her lap. A man in a gray blazer wiping sweat from his brow. The smell of too much cologne mixing with old wood. Kendrick slid into a seat near the back, opened his folder, and let his eyes fall across the evidence he had assembled with care. But when the heavy doors swung open and the judge entered, his attention shifted. Charles Whitman. Tall, silver-haired, with eyes like steel. He carried his robe as if it were armor, scanning the room with a gaze that caught every twitch, every breath, every hesitation. The bailiff called the room to rise. The shuffle of shoes filled the silence, then fell away as Whitman lowered himself into the high-backed chair. The cases rolled one after another. Crisp, mechanical. People stammered. He silenced them with a glance. He moved with the ease of a man too used to power. Kendrick watched carefully, his lawyer's mind cataloging every detail. A man in a suit slipped in late. No reaction. A young woman entered after him, taking her seat unnoticed. No reprimand. At 9:15, Kendrick heard his own name. He rose, folder in hand, and walked to the podium, his pulse steady, his steps measured. "Mr. Robinson," the judge said, his voice slicing through the air like a blade. "You're late. Do you think the court's time is less valuable than your own?" The words hit harder than they should have. The courtroom froze. Dozens of eyes turned. Kendrick lifted his hand slightly, palms out in a gesture of respect. "Your Honor, I apologize. My delay was due to urgent federal matters." "Excuses," Whitman snapped, cutting him off. His eyes narrowed, lips pressed thin. "This court operates on order and respect. You've undermined that. You are fined $750. Consider this a lesson." The words slammed down like a gavel. "Fine. For being minutes late." Kendrick's jaw tightened, but his face remained calm. Around him, whispers rippled like a current. The young woman who had walked in late glanced at him nervously. The man in the gray blazer dropped his eyes. No one else had been punished. Not a single one. Kendrick felt the weight of the room pressing down on him, the unfairness sharp and undeniable. He stood silent for a beat, then spoke evenly. "Your Honor, may I present my case?" But the judge raised his hand, already moving to the next file. "Your fine stands. Let this court be a reminder. You are not above its rules." Kendrick stepped back slowly. The murmurs thickened, disbelief written across faces. He had spent his life in courtrooms. He knew when discipline was real and when it was weaponized. This wasn't about tardiness. This was something deeper. As he returned to his seat, Kendrick opened his folder. Not for his grandmother's property records, but for a blank page. His pen moved fast, each stroke heavy. He was no longer just preparing to fight for his house. He was preparing to fight for something much larger. The courtroom felt colder than before, even though the air conditioning hadn't changed. Every whisper seemed to echo against the walls as the judge's sharp words lingered in the air. The man stood there, his dark skin illuminated under the harsh fluorescent lights. His jaw tightening but his eyes refusing to look away. The gavel had struck against the wooden block, not just to fine him, but to humiliate him in front of strangers who didn't know his name, his story, or his worth. A woman in the gallery shifted uncomfortably, her hands gripping her purse. An older man cleared his throat as if to say something, then thought better of it. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the faint scratching of a clerk's pen across paper, recording a judgment that already felt unjust. The man's heart pounded, but he controlled his breathing. He had been in rooms far more hostile than this one, rooms where every word spoken carried consequences bigger than fines or insults. He knew the weight of silence. He knew the danger of speaking too soon. Still, the sting of being reduced to nothing by a man who wore a robe as a shield pressed deep into his chest. He glanced at the rows of people waiting their turn. Their eyes darted between him and the bench, curiosity mixed with unease. Some looked sympathetic, others indifferent, but no one moved. That was the way of courtrooms. One voice, one authority, and everyone else expected to bow their head. The judge leaned back in his chair, tapping the side of his gavel as though he'd already forgotten the name of the man he had just fined. His lips curled into the faintest smirk, the kind that carried arrogance disguised as law. He didn't see a man standing before him. He saw only the color of his skin, and that was enough to determine guilt in his mind. But what the judge didn't know was that this man carried more power than anyone in the room suspected. Behind the calm exterior was a trained professional who had walked into federal courtrooms across the country, who had dismantled cases, cross-examined witnesses, and spoken words that shaped verdicts. Today, though, he wasn't here in that role. Today, he had come as an ordinary citizen, dressed simply, without his badge, without his title, just a man seeking fairness in a system that claimed to offer justice. He felt the urge to speak, to strip away the false power the judge clung to. But instead he let the silence breathe. Every second of it tightened the noose around the arrogance on the bench. The longer he stayed quiet, the more uneasy the courtroom became. People shifted in their seats. A young law student in the back began scribbling faster in her notebook, sensing that something unusual was unfolding. Finally, he lifted his chin and spoke. His voice steady but low enough that the entire room leaned in to hear. "Is that all, Your Honor?" The judge blinked, caught off guard by the tone. Not defensive, not submissive, but controlled. "That is all. Pay your fine and step aside." Beat passed. The man's lips curved into the faintest smile, not of amusement but of resolve. He reached slowly into the inner pocket of his jacket, and a hush fell across the courtroom. Even the bailiff tensed, his hand brushing the side of his holster, unsure of what was about to happen. What emerged was not a weapon, but a small leather-bound identification case. He held it with precision, as though every movement carried intention. With a calm flick, he opened it and placed it gently on the wooden podium in front of him, angled so the judge could see clearly. The silence cracked. Gasps rose from the gallery, a sharp intake of breath from the clerk, and the law student's pen froze mid-sentence. The judge leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as he read the words that shifted the entire balance of the room. Federal Prosecutor, Department of Justice. For the first time that morning, the judge's smirk faltered. The judge's eyes froze on the badge, the color draining slowly from his face as if someone had pulled the very arrogance out of him. His lips parted, but no sound came out at first. The room, which had been humming with suppressed whispers just moments ago, fell into a heavy silence. Even the sound of the ceiling fan seemed louder now, cutting through the air like a blade. The man did not raise his voice. He did not slam his hand on the podium or shout for justice. Instead, he simply stood taller, letting the truth of his identity settle in the space between him and the man who had mocked him. There was no anger in his eyes, only a depth that carried years of experience, battles fought in courtrooms far larger than this, and a calm confidence that could not be shaken by prejudice. A murmur rippled through the gallery, people shifting, leaning forward to get a clearer view of the badge. A woman gasped softly, covering her mouth with her hand. The young law student scribbled furiously, her pen trembling with the weight of what she was witnessing. The bailiff's posture shifted. Where moments ago his hand had hovered near his holster, now it rested awkwardly by his side, uncertain whether to stand at attention or fade into the background. The judge coughed, his voice suddenly brittle. This is highly irregular," he muttered, his fingers tapping nervously against the gavel. His gaze flicked between the badge and the man's steady eyes, unable to mask the unease that had taken root in his chest. The man tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "Irregular." His voice was calm, yet it carried a quiet power that filled the room. What's irregular is a court where fairness is determined by the color of someone's skin. What's irregular is justice being handed out like a weapon, instead of a shield. The words struck like thunder, not because they were loud, but because they were true. The gallery shifted again, people whispering now, the tension swelling. The clerk's hand trembled as she set her pen down, afraid to record what might come next. The judge's jaw tightened, but he couldn't find the authority he once had. The robe that gave him power now felt like a costume, thin, fragile, and exposed. I had no idea," he stammered, though the excuse hung weakly in the air. The man leaned forward slightly, his voice low but unmistakable. "That's exactly the problem. You never cared to know. You looked at me, and you already decided what I was worth." A wave of silence rolled through the room. Even the faint buzzing of the fluorescent lights seemed to bow to the weight of his words. Somewhere in the back, the old man who had been silent earlier nodded to himself, as if this moment had been long overdue. For the first time, the judge couldn't meet his eyes. His hands fumbled with the papers before him, desperate to reclaim control, but the truth was already loose in the room, and it could not be contained. The man slowly closed the badge case, slipping it back into his jacket. He didn't need to flash it any longer. The image of it was already burned into every mind present. He straightened, his presence towering even without a raised voice. "I came here as an ordinary citizen," he continued, his tone carrying both grace and steel. "But you reminded me why I chose to become what I am. Because men like you sit in judgment, forgetting that justice belongs to the people, not to your prejudice." The gallery erupted, not in cheers, but in gasps, whispers, and restless shifting. The atmosphere was electric, the balance of power shattered. The judge, who had entered with smug confidence, now sat cornered in his own domain. The judge's hands trembled slightly as he adjusted his glasses, his voice breaking with forced authority. "Order in the court," he barked, but the command lacked its usual thunder. It was thin, shaky, like glass ready to shatter. The murmurs in the gallery quieted, yet the silence that followed was heavier, filled with judgment not from the bench, but from the people. The man did not flinch. His posture remained steady. His eyes locked on the judge with the calm certainty of someone who had nothing left to prove. Every second of silence dragged the truth deeper into the walls of the courtroom. This was no longer the judge's arena. "You will mind your tone in this court," the judge tried again, tapping the gavel with a nervous hand. But the sound, once sharp and commanding, now rang hollow, as though even the wood refused to lend him power. The man leaned forward slightly, his voice quiet but razor-sharp. My tone doesn't strip dignity from innocent people. My tone doesn't silence voices based on the color of their skin. My tone doesn't carry a gavel that punishes the powerless while excusing the privileged." A ripple went through the crowd. Gasps, nods, even a few murmured words of agreement. The young law student scribbled faster than ever, her wide eyes flicking between the man and the judge, realizing she was witnessing history, not just another court session. The judge's face flushed, his authority crumbling under the weight of words he couldn't control. "You are dangerously close to contempt," he said, though his voice cracked mid-sentence. The man straightened, his presence towering without effort. "Contempt." He let the word hang, his gaze unwavering. "I've spent years inside federal courts, defending this system against corruption, fighting to ensure that justice means something. I know contempt, Your Honor, and it doesn't look like me. It looks like this moment. It looks like you." The gallery broke again, a low murmur swelling into a storm. The bailiff shifted uneasily, glancing at the judge, then at the man, unsure where the authority truly rested now. The clerk sat frozen, her pen still, her eyes wide with disbelief. The judge's fingers dug into the wooden edge of his bench, his knuckles white. For the first time, sweat formed on his forehead, betraying the mask of calm he had tried to wear. His robe, once a symbol of command, now looked heavy, suffocating, like a cloak that no longer fit. The man took a single step closer, his voice lowering into something intimate, yet devastating. "You thought today you could embarrass me, that you could make me small in front of strangers. But here's what you don't understand." He paused, the silence amplifying every heartbeat in the room. "I don't stand here alone. Every person you've dismissed, every voice you've silenced, every unfair ruling you've made, they stand here with me. And they see you now, for what you are." The words pierced deeper than any shout could. The judge's lips quivered, his eyes darting nervously across the room, realizing the faces looking at him no longer saw authority. They saw weakness. They saw a man unmasked. The young woman in the gallery, clutching her purse, whispered softly to the person beside her. "He's not afraid of him. Not at all." And in that single observation, the truth crystallized. The courtroom no longer belonged to the judge. It belonged to the man who had been underestimated, belittled, and dismissed, until now. The judge's breathing had grown heavier, though he tried to disguise it with quick sips of water from the glass beside him. But even the way his hand trembled as he lifted it betrayed his nerves. His eyes darted across the courtroom, searching desperately for support, but every face he met reflected the same truth. No one was with him anymore. The man stood calm, his silence now louder than any gavel strike. The stillness in his eyes carried more weight than the judge's words ever could. It was the kind of silence that broke masks, the kind that left no place to hide. Finally, the judge tried to push back. His voice rose, shaky but desperate. "This court will not tolerate theatrics. You are here as a defendant, not as a..." The man cut him off, his voice deep and controlled. "No, I am here as a citizen, and your robe does not give you the right to strip me of that dignity." The words fell like hammers, striking not just the judge but everyone listening. Gasps rippled through the gallery, the sound swelling like a wave crashing against the walls. The bailiff shifted again, no longer standing at rigid attention but leaning slightly, his eyes betraying confusion, almost respect for the man who dared speak what so many had swallowed in silence. The judge's lips quivered. His cheeks burned red, not with authority but with humiliation. He slammed the gavel against the block, the sharp crack echoing. "Order! I demand order!" But the command fell flat. The gavel's echo faded quickly, drowned beneath the low hum of whispers that refused to die. Even the clerk, who had faithfully recorded every word, now sat frozen, her pen motionless. She too was watching the robe unravel. The man's voice broke through the noise, steady, calm, unshaken. "Order! That's all we've ever asked for. True order. Real justice. Not this." He gestured subtly toward the bench, his tone cutting sharper than any shout. "Not a performance of justice. Not prejudice wrapped in authority." The young law student in the back pressed her hand against her chest, her eyes wide. She had studied cases of injustice, read books filled with examples, but never before had she seen a man dismantle bias so calmly, so thoroughly in real time. She whispered under her breath, almost to herself, "This is history." The judge's hands trembled harder now. His voice broke as he tried once more. You think you can walk into my courtroom and lecture me?" The man's gaze didn't waver. "I don't need to lecture you. I only needed to stand here long enough for everyone to see who you truly are." A stunned silence followed, thicker than before. For the first time in his career, the judge looked smaller than the man before him. Diminished, exposed, stripped of the authority he had clung to like armor. A cough broke out from somewhere in the gallery, followed by a low murmur of agreement. Someone whispered, "He's right." Another nodded silently, eyes never leaving the man at the podium. Slowly the tide had turned. The authority of the bench had crumbled, and the weight of the room shifted entirely. The judge leaned back, gripping the arms of his chair tightly, as though the very seat beneath him was slipping away. The man, meanwhile, stood taller than ever, his presence filling the room. He didn't need to raise his voice. He didn't need to argue. His very existence, his truth, was the loudest statement.